1763, the British Empire had just won the greatest war in North America. France was defeated, its forts had fallen, its colonies had been claimed. From London to Boston. Victory celebrations filled the streets. The British believed they now ruled an empire that stretched farther than ever. Before there was only one problem. The people who had lived on this land for centuries had never surrendered. Deep beyond the Appalachian Mountains, across endless forests, rivers, and hidden villages, a new alliance was taking shape. Not an army built by kings, not an empire driven by wealth, but a united resistance determined to protect its homeland at any cost. At its center stood one man, Pontiac. An Odawa war leader whose name would strike fear into British commanders across the frontier. Within a matter of weeks. British forts would burn, supply lines would disappear. Entire garrisons would vanish, and an empire that believed the war was over would suddenly find itself fighting for survival once again. This wasn't just another frontier conflict. It became one of the greatest indigenous uprisings in North American history. A war that forced the mighty British Empire to change its policies, and unknowingly planted the first seeds of the American Revolution. This is the true story of Pontiac's War, the native uprising that changed America's future forever. By 1763, Britain stood at the height of its power. After years of brutal fighting in the French and Indian War, the North American theater of the 7 Years' War, Britain had defeated France and gained control of vast territories, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River. On paper, the victory looked complete. French forts were now occupied by British soldiers. Military maps were redrawn. European politicians celebrated what they believed was a permanent expansion of the British Empire. Those maps ignored a critical truth. These lands were not empty. For generations, powerful indigenous nations, including the Odawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Shawnee, Delaware, and many others, had lived, traded, hunted, and defended these territories. They had formed alliances with the French, not because they were subjects of France, but because the French generally relied on diplomacy, trade, and gift-giving to maintain relationships with native nations. When Britain replaced France, everything changed. British commanders viewed the frontier very differently. General Jeffrey Amherst believed expensive diplomatic traditions with indigenous nations were unnecessary. He reduced the practice of gift-giving, restricted trade, and even limited access to essential supplies such as gunpowder and ammunition. To British officials, these were cost-saving measures. To native communities, they were acts of disrespect and a direct threat to their survival. Across the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley, anger began to spread. What Britain saw as a new empire. The indigenous nations saw as an occupation. And in the forest surrounding Detroit, one leader was quietly bringing different tribes together for a common cause. His name was Pontiac. The empire believed the war had ended. In reality, a far more dangerous conflict was only just beginning. As British officers celebrated their victory, a very different conversation was taking place deep within the forests of the Great Lakes. There were no royal palaces, no grand military headquarters. No polished maps spread across wooden tables. Instead, tribal leaders gathered around council fires, discussing a single question: how long would Britain respect their lands? The answer, many believed, was painfully clear. Britain had no intention of treating indigenous nations as equal allies. Fort after fort was now occupied by British troops. Trade was becoming increasingly restricted. Settlers were pushing farther west. Many native leaders feared that this was only the beginning. Among them was an Odawa leader named Pontiac, although later generations often described him as the sole leader of the Uprising. Reality was more complex. Pontiac was not a king who commanded every nation. He was a respected war leader whose influence helped inspire a much broader resistance. His greatest strength was not simply courage, it was persuasion. He traveled from village to village, meeting with leaders from different nations. The Odawa, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, the Shawnee, the Delaware. Many had different traditions and different interests, but they shared one growing fear. If they waited too long, their lands, their independence, and their future might disappear forever. At the same time, a powerful spiritual movement was spreading across Indigenous communities. The Delaware prophet Neolin urged native peoples to reject European influence, abandon dependence on British goods, and return to their traditional ways of life. His message reached far beyond religion. It became a call for unity for many warriors. This was no longer just a political struggle. It became a fight to protect their culture, their families, and their identity. Pontiac embraced that vision. He understood that no single nation could challenge the British alone. Together, the frontier could become impossible to control. During the spring of 1763, preparations quietly accelerated. Messengers crossed forests and rivers carrying news between distant villages. Weapons were repaired. Food was stored. Warriors gathered without attracting British attention. Inside the forts, British commanders remained confident. Most believed the French defeat had ended all serious resistance. Few realized that beyond the tree line, hundreds of warriors were preparing for coordinated attacks across the frontier. The British Empire believed it had inherited peace. Instead, it had inherited a conflict. Unlike anything it had expected, within days, that confidence would begin to collapse. One by one, the frontier forts would come under attack, and the first target would be one of Britain's most important strongholds in the West Fort Detroit. In the spring of 1763, the British frontier still looked calm. Inside Fort Detroit, British officers followed their daily routines, convinced that France's defeat had secured Britain's future in North America. The wooden walls of the fort stood strong, its cannons overlooked. The Detroit River supplies continued to arrive. To the soldiers inside, the danger seemed distant, but beyond the forest surrounding the fort, events were unfolding that British commanders failed to understand. Pontiac had spent months building alliances. Messengers moved silently between villages. Warriors gathered without attracting attention. Every meeting, every journey, and every promise had one purpose: to strike together. Pontiac's first objective was Fort Detroit, one of Britain's most important military positions in the Great Lakes region. His original strategy was bold. He planned to enter the fort peacefully with several warriors carrying weapons hidden beneath their blankets. Once inside, they would launch a surprise attack, eliminate the officers, and capture the fort before the garrison could react. If successful, Detroit would become the symbol of a much larger uprising, but history rarely follows a perfect plan. Before the meeting took place, British Commander Major Henry Gladwin reportedly received intelligence warning that an attack might be coming. Historians still debate exactly how the warning reached him. Some accounts suggest that the information came from native allies. Others point to different sources. Whatever the truth, Gladwin immediately strengthened the fort's defenses. When Pontiac and his delegation entered Fort Detroit on May 7, 1763, they found British soldiers fully armed and waiting. The element of surprise had vanished. Pontiac quickly realized that the plan had failed. Rather than risking a battle inside the fort, he withdrew his warriors. The opportunity was gone. but the war had only just begun. The very next day, Pontiac's warriors surrounded Fort Detroit. What had been planned as a swift capture turned into a long and exhausting siege. No major assaults were launched against the thick wooden walls. Instead, Pontiac chose a different strategy. He isolated the fort. Supply routes were disrupted. Travel became dangerous. Anyone leaving the safety of the fort risked being attacked. British patrols suddenly discovered that the forests around them were no longer under their control. The frontier itself had become the battlefield. As news spread across the Great Lakes, other indigenous nations launched coordinated attacks on British positions. One by one, isolated forts began to fall. Small garrisons found themselves surrounded. Communication collapsed. Entire regions disappeared from British control almost overnight. For many officers, the speed of the uprising was shocking. Only weeks earlier, Britain believed it ruled an uncontested empire. Now, its frontier defenses were crumbling. And the greatest shock was still to come. Hundreds of miles away, another British fort would be captured through one of the most ingenious deceptions in North American history. A game that looked completely harmless until the gates were opened. As the siege of Fort Detroit continued, panic spread across the British frontier. Messengers struggled to carry news between isolated outposts. Supply routes were breaking down. One by one, British forts found themselves cut off from reinforcements, but while British commanders expected another direct attack, one group of indigenous warriors chose a far more brilliant strategy. Their target was Fort Michilimackinac, a key British post located between Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. The fort was heavily dependent on the trust that had existed between British soldiers and the surrounding native communities. That trust would soon become its greatest weakness. On June 2nd, 1763, several native players gathered outside the fort for what appeared to be a friendly game of lacrosse. To the British soldiers watching from the walls, there was nothing unusual. Lacrosse was a familiar sport. Large crowds often gathered to watch these matches. The players ran across the open field, passing the ball back and forth with incredible speed. Soldiers laughed. Officers relaxed. Some even stepped outside to enjoy the game. Then everything changed. At the perfect moment, the ball was intentionally thrown toward the open gate of the fort. The players rushed after it. Waiting nearby, native women quickly handed concealed weapons to the warriors. Within seconds, the game became an attack. The surprised British soldiers had almost no time to react. Michilimackinac fell with remarkable speed. For the British, the loss was more than a military defeat. It shattered their confidence. If a major fort could be captured through deception instead of force, and no outpost on the frontier was truly secure. Across the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley, similar attacks continued. Several forts were abandoned. Others surrendered after being isolated. British commanders suddenly realized they were facing something far larger than scattered raids. This was a coordinated uprising, stretching across hundreds of miles. Fear spread throughout the frontier settlements. Families fled eastward. Merchants abandoned trade routes. Military reports arriving in the colonies painted a grim picture. An empire that had celebrated victory only months earlier was now struggling simply to hold its own territory. Despite these remarkable successes, Pontiac and his allies faced a growing challenge. The British Empire still possessed enormous resources. Fresh troops were already being organized. Experienced officers prepared plans to reopen supply lines and relieve the besieged forts. The conflict was entering a new phase. The early victories had proven that Britain could be shaken. Military history Now came the harder question: could the alliance actually defeat the most powerful empire in the world? The answer would be decided in brutal battles that followed, including the desperate defense of Fort Pitt, the Battle of Bushy Run, and a decision that would leave one of the darkest stains in British by. The late summer of 1763, the British Empire had begun to recover. Fresh regiments crossed the Atlantic, supply columns pushed toward the western frontier. British commanders knew that if they failed to break the sieges, their newly won empire could collapse before it had truly begun. One of the most desperate battles unfolded near Fort Pitt. The isolated garrison was surrounded, short on supplies, and waiting for help that seemed impossible to reach. As fighting intensified, one of the darkest episodes in British colonial history took place. Historical records reveal that British officers discussed using smallpox-contaminated items from the fort's hospital in an attempt to spread disease among indigenous forces. Historians continue to debate the overall impact of this act on the wider outbreak, but the documents themselves remain one of the earliest recorded examples of biological warfare in North American history. Meanwhile, relief finally arrived. Colonel Henry Bouquet led British troops westward to rescue the isolated forts. On August 5th and 6th, 1763, his force encountered Indigenous warriors near Bushy Run. The battle was fierce. For 2 exhausting days, both sides fought through dense woodland, where every tree could hide an enemy. Bouquet eventually used a carefully planned feigned retreat, drawing warriors into an exposed position before launching a powerful counterattack. The strategy worked. British forces broke through and successfully relieved Fort Pitt. It was one of the turning points of the entire conflict. Yet, despite that victory, Britain had learned a painful lesson. Military strength alone could not control the vast interior of North America. The frontier was simply too large, and the indigenous nations too determined. As the fighting gradually slowed, many native leaders recognized that a complete military victory was becoming increasingly difficult. Pontiac's alliance slowly weakened as different nations faced different local pressures and priorities. By 1766, Pontiac formally met British officials and agreed to end hostilities. The war was over, but its consequences had only begun. London realized that continuing westward expansion without limits would trigger endless wars. In response, King George III issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, establishing a boundary along the Appalachian Mountains and reserving vast western territories for indigenous nations. To native communities, it was an acknowledgement, however, limited, that their resistance had forced the world's most powerful empire to change its policies. But to many American colonists, it felt like betrayal. Thousands of settlers who hoped to move west suddenly found themselves blocked by their own government. Anger spread throughout the colonies. Many believed Britain cared more about controlling the frontier than rewarding the people who had helped build the empire. Over the next decade, that resentment continued to grow. New taxes, new restrictions, new political conflicts. Eventually, those tensions erupted into another war, the American Revolution. In that sense, Pontiac's war became far more than a frontier uprising. It reshaped British colonial policy. It exposed the limits of imperial power. It demonstrated the determination and military skill of indigenous nations defending their homeland. It helped create the political conditions that would eventually give birth to the United States. History often remembers the American Revolution. Far fewer people remember the conflict that came just before, the war that forced Britain to rethink its empire, the war that proved North America could never be ruled by military force alone. And the war led by an Odawa leader whose name still echoes through history. Pontiac. This was Pontiac's war. The native uprising that shook the British Empire and quietly changed the future of America forever.